Beloved, good morning, beloveds. Peace, love, and harmony to each cell body of life. If God returned today, would you believe it, beloveds? If God said, I came to give you life abundantly, would you believe it, beloveds? If God lived in every cell in your body, would you believe it, beloveds? That in which you are the living right, the living cell body to life, but you have denied your living right by believing those who tell you you are sickness, sin, and death. If God returned today and said, I came to give you health, love, life, and abundance, beloveds, would you believe? Would you believe it? You are the cell of life. You are the seed and the faith of a mustard seed. But your living right must be believed within every cell that lives inside of the living cell body of life to be established. Each and every one of us have been denied our right by not being immune to our own living cell body. We believe that sickness lives outside of us. Sickness is the mind that denies health. Poverty is the mind that denies that they are divinity as a cellular body of life. Everything that has been sustaining us has been a truth that has been untold to every living cell body of life. If God returned today, would you believe it, beloveds? It only can live within your body, mind, and soul. You are the universal law of life. If God returned today, would you believe it? It only can live and be sustained within each and every cell body of life. Not outside of us, not in the books, not in anything that the world has told us. If God returned today, would you believe it? Would you accept it? Would you want life abundantly? Would you want health? Would you believe that you have the right and the authority to sustain health, to sustain wealth, to sustain life only within your cellular nature? Does God give authority? Does God unleash our substance? Does God give us immunity to life and to rebuke everything that has been denying each and every living cell body of life their right to govern themselves accordingly? If God returned today, beloveds, would you believe it? Would you share it? Would you deny it? Would you sustain it? Would you provide for it? Would you accept your own perfect will? If God returned today, what would you ask for? Would you ask for life? Or would you ask that every living cell body, every child of the Most High be sustained under the universal law called life? Not the universal law called death, not the universal law called sickness, not the universal law called sin. Would you believe in your own right? Would you want life? Would you want life abundantly? Or would you keep allowing those leading us under sickness, sin, and death to be our God? Would you give away your right? Would you give away your heart and your substance? Guard your heart through all of life flows. Do you understand who you are? Do you understand your heart pumps the blood? It pumps life. And because our hearts have been so darkened by hate, by injustice, by those who have not fed us with equality, by those who have denied us equality, that we don't even understand that our heart came to give us life and to give us life abundantly as we filled it with love, as we filled it with truth, as we filled it with the wisdom of the Most High and not the wisdom of man, not the wisdom of doubt, not the wisdom of fear, not the wisdom that has led us generation upon generation in sickness, sin, and death. If God returned today, beloveds, would you call upon God's name for life and life abundant? Would you call upon God's name for health? Do you know that health is the living cell body? Do you know that health flows through love? Do you know that health is sustainable only through the one that believes in it? If God returned today, would you believe his truth? Would you believe its living word? Would you believe that it lived in you and that you have already had victory over it? But because you took your authority outside of God's will and gave it to man, gave it to word, gave it to beliefs, gave it to those who have never treated us equal to God's will, who has never treated us equal to health, who has never treated us equal to wealth, who has never treated us equal to life. You have given God's perfect loving will over to the wills of those who are not for us. And is it wrong, beloveds? No, it's only thy will done in me. If I give my will over to a will that does not sustain me, it will deny me the will of God. If I give my health over to beliefs that cannot sustain me, my body will die by the will of that belief. If I give my authority over to a system that does not treat every living cell body under equality, I will die by that program's will, by that program's belief. I will die. The living cell body will die. I am the living will of God. I am the word of God. Every cell body is under the covenant of God. But every mind has been under the covenant of beliefs and under man's covenant and under man's authority and under man's immunity. And man's immunity is sinful, sickness, and death. God's authority is peace, love, and a living cell body called life that should never deny its living right to honor any right that does not give it life, that does not give it sustainability, and that does not give it the law of truth. If God returned today, beloveds, would you believe it? If God returned today, would you share this message with every living cell body of life? If God returned today, would you seek the will of God, or would you seek the will of the world? Beloveds, it's time to wake up. There is no fear but the fear that we cast upon each other in beliefs. Perfect love casts out all fear because it cleanses the cellular body and it gives you the truth body of life that God has already ordained for each and every living cell body of life. Each and every one of us have God's living truth inside of us. But we've taken that truth, we've taken that immunity, and we've given it over to those who live outside of that immunity, who live outside of that truth, who live outside of God's perfect loving will that flows abundantly through each and every one of us. Guard your hearts, beloveds, because all of life flows. How? Who is teaching you the will of God? Who is denying you the will of God? Who has led you outside of God's perfect immunity? You're a living cell body. Why don't you understand this? Why don't you believe in your own living right? Why don't you believe in health? Why don't you believe that your cell is immunity and that it has the power to seek and ye shall find anything it's asking for? Why don't you know your living truth, beloveds? Why? If God returned today, would you believe it? If God spoke every word of life and truth and health and abundance in you today, would you want to receive it? If God said, I am, and you are because I am, would you believe it? Beloveds, it's time for us to wake up. Every living cell body has the right. Every living cell body has the immunity, and every living cell body has already been ordained with the substance of life. But we take our mind, our bodies, and our souls, and we sow them into injustice. We sow them into imperfection. We sow them into people who have no right over us, who have no authority to give us that which God's authority has already ordained inside of every living cell body called life. We feed off of sickness. We feed off of sin. We feed off of fear. We feed off of those who have no right to govern us, who have no authority to govern us, and who have no wisdom to govern us under God's will. Your cell is life. Your blood should flow abundantly for life, and your mind should sustain all of life. But who teaches you about your truth? Who teaches you about God's nature that already lives inside of you? Who teaches you that you are true immunity to all that sickness, sin, and death? Once you believe, seek and ye shall find. Find what? Truth. And it shall sustain each and every one of God's living cell bodies called life once we stop giving our authority to anything outside of it, to anyone who has denied us, to any system that has not been equality to each and every one of God's children's. Why do we believe in anything that causes us harm? Why do we believe in anything that says it shall sustain us and we have never been sustained, beloveds? Truth shall set us free. Believing in the righteous mind shall set us free, and believing in our cell body that came to give us life and to give us life abundantly and to flow through us as immunity, not as sickness, not as sin, and not as death. Thy will be done, beloveds. Truth came as our living testimony, and yet none of us abide in it. Life came as the cell body to sustain each and every one of God's images, and yet we don't believe in it. Everything that we have been taught denies us the living right, the living truth, and the living body, and the living image of that in which each and every one of us has already been ordained to be and to become, because we were made in the image of God, the living cell body of life. Beloveds, without the cell, the body wouldn't exist. But we don't honor the cell. We honor the flesh body. The flesh body didn't give us life, beloveds. The cell body did. And each and every one of us have the authority and the immunity to heal every sickness, sin, and death that has been pushed, injected, taught, and led for us to believe outside of God's perfect loving will that lives only within each and every cell body. Your body is the mind of God, and yet you don't believe it. If God came back today and was speaking life into each and every one of us, would you believe it, beloveds? Your immunity is having the faith of a mustard seed. Your immunity is rebuking anything that denies you that immunity. Your immunity is rebuking every system, every program, everything that lives outside of you and denies you the living truth. Your immunity is honoring perfect love so abundantly that it casts away anything feeding you fear, anything injecting fear into your cell, anything denying you your right to truth. Your immunity is a righteous mind that will never lie, that will never lead you out of equality, that will never tell you you are not righteous, that will never tell you that you are not the living cell body of God. Your immunity is truth, beloveds. Jesus said it the best. Truth shall set us free. And yet, everything governing you has never taught you this. Everything that you give your faith, everything that you sow your seed into, everything that you believe in does not tell you this. Beloveds, thy will is done. Thy will has already been done, but you have denied it to be and to become that in which has been teaching you and governing you outside of God's beautiful, perfect, loving will. To be and to become and to be governed by that in which has never given you equality to God's substance, to God's living truth, to God's authority. Seek ye now and you shall find. You are already it, beloveds. If God returned today, would you believe this? Would you have the faith of a mustard seed that he sowed as the living cell body of life in each and every one of us, beloveds? Would you believe the living truth only can be sustained within your cell body? Would you take your truth and sow it into a world that has denied you, called you the most sinful things that can only be created inside of you, a minority, a citizen, a sin, a sickness, a death, a poverty. Would you deny God to become that insanity that you have been led to become as a living cell body of life? Each and every one of us was guaranteed life. Each and every one of us was guaranteed abundance by our own cell body, but we denied it to be sustained by those who have no will, who have no right to govern God's authority, to govern God's perfect love, to govern God's immunity that lives only within the living cell body called life. Every mind, body, and soul that has been taking you outside of God's perfect love and will has sowed nothing but sickness, sin, and death inside of you, beloveds. And you've given your complete authority to give them that right to destroy God within. You've given them your substance. You sow seeds into their power. You sow seeds into their belief. You sow seeds into their program. And now it is destroying you by their will, by their might, by their beliefs, and by the authority that they have governed every sovereign being by outside of God's perfect loving will, outside of God's perfect immunity, outside of the flow of life that should be flowing through each and every living cell body called life. If God returned today, beloveds, would you believe it? If God came back today to give you life and to give you life abundantly, would you accept it? Or would you ignore it? Or would you call it crazy? Or would you allow that in which has no love for you to keep governing you under a system that will automatically deny God's perfect loving will within you, within every cell body? Each and every one of us overflows with abundance. Each and every one of us is the seed in the vessel to life, and yet we have not sustained it. Why, beloveds? Because your belief in God has been denied. It has been destroyed by the will of those who don't treat you equally to life, by the will of those who do not treat you equally to health, by the will of those who do not treat you equally to love, by the will of those who call themselves authority, and they have no power but to govern sickness, sin, and death. And that must now become your living right to life. Beloveds, if God returned today and spoke life, spoke authority, spoke peace, spoke love, spoke truth inside of every living cell body called life, would you accept it? Or would you deny it? Or would you let those who have been denying God's living perfect right and will to be denied from you? Each and every one of us are sovereign beings called life, and we must accept, we must believe, and we must seek and find that in which we are under the law of truth. God has revealed truth that no man can deny. And he has spoke life into me to receive and to send out to every living cell body called life. And if God returned today, beloveds, would you accept God's perfect loving will to sustain you, to heal you, to never deny you, to never lead you under inequality, to never lead you under injustice, to never lead you under sickness, to never lead you as sin, and to never deny you your living right to life? If God returned today, would you stand in God's favor? Would you stand in God's victory? Would you stand in God's truth? Or would you deny it to be led by those who have no right over God's substance, who have no right over God's living body, who hold no truth to that in which you have already been ordained? Beloveds, this word shall resonate in every living cell body as substance. It shall not be denied by anything standing against the perfect love and will of God. This word shall not return void, as it is the living will of God, as it is the living word of God. And anything that opposes it, anything that stands against it will now be exposed. It will be delivered by its own creation. Thy will is done. God's perfect loving will is spoken. And each living cell body shall hear this testimony. And every will, every unrighteous mind, and every unrighteous power that is standing against this word shall uplift it, shall embody it, and shall send it forth in perfect love, that every one of God's children shall now become the living body of life, shall know the living truth lives within, and anything standing against it shall now be denied by its own living will. You have no right to deny God's love. It's perfect, and it flows abundantly through each and every living cell body called life. And every one that has been denying it, every one that has been taking us from it, and every one of us that have been denied shall now be given back that in which God has already ordained. No one denying us shall have the power, shall have the authority to govern us any longer. They will now be exposed by the living truth. Health shall go before anything that has been leading us under sickness. God's divine, perfect, loving will shall go before anything that has been leading us under fear and death. God's perfect love shall cast away all fear and shall expose any mind, body, and soul that has been leading us under injustice, inequality, and anything that has denied us perfect love. It shall all be cast away today, beloveds. You don't need to believe, because I am the faith of a mustard seed. God's truth lives inside of me, and I am the living testimony of life. I am the living testimony of truth because I didn't deny it. I didn't allow the world to deny me of my living right and of my living truth, and I stand as victory. I stand as the faith of a mustard seed, and I let life flow through me abundantly for all, so that no cell body of life shall be denied from this day forward. Your faith is inevitable. Your life is infinite and immortal. And those who have not led us under this truth, they will now be exposed. And perfect love shall cast away the fear that has led them to lead every living cell body of life outside of God's perfect love and will. Love shall reign supreme in every heart, every mind, and every body, and every soul. And we shall not believe in anything that lives outside of God. From this day forward, we shall embody the living truth called life. I don't need you to believe me. I don't even need you to accept this. By the living body, by every cell body called life, I seeked and I was found. And my word is bond, and it shall not return void, but go on and do that in which life has already ordained it, and that in which love has already ordained it, and that in which immunity has already ordained it, and that in which truth has already ordained it. Thy will is done in me, and everything that has denied shall be rebuked. It shall be cast, and it shall be uprooted from that in which God never created it. Thy will is done. Each and every one of God's children shall now remember who they are. They shall never be denied again who they are not. Thy will is done. And if God came back today, beloveds, what would you believe? What would you ask for? What would you become? These are questions that life is asking you, beloveds. Seek and you shall find. Ask and it shall be given. No living right of God's should have ever been denied their living truth. While we following that Bible, while we following those preaching and teaching that Bible, and yet we still not under God's covenant, is a sinful nature. And today, I release that sinful nature from each and every cell body called life. And it is now restored and renewed and rejuvenated with that in which God has already ordained, the living body of life. Amen. God bless us all. And God has mercy over our souls. And those who haven't, they shall now be uprooted and uplifted from their authority, from leading us outside in sickness, sin, and death, because our only right is life and life abundantly. And today, that cell, that seed, and that life is now sustained under the will and the authority of God, of life, of love, and of perfect will. Immortal cells, through your own blood, you shall now be sustained.